Welcome back to another episode of the Drum Candy Podcast. This is your host, Mike Dawson, coming to you from Drum Factory Direct in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In this special episode, I'm handing the reins over to Thomas Wendt, who's going to talk a little bit about the great big Sid Catlett, and he's also bringing in a frequent guest here, Kenny Washington, to offer his insight into the legendary jazz drummer, big Sid Catlett. Before I pass it over to Tom, I want to remind you to make sure you are liking and sharing and subscribing, and if you haven't already, give us a 5-star rating and write a review in your podcast app. If you're on YouTube, hit us with some comments, some requests, some suggestions for future episodes. We are wrapping up Season 7 here shortly, and we are in pre-production mode for Season 8. So now's the time to get your ideas into me. You can always email me at drumcandypodcast@gmail.com, or you can DM me at Mike Dawson Drums, or you can shoot a message over to the Drum Factory Direct Instagram page, and we'll get to you there. At the end of this episode, after Thomas and Kenny's discussion about big Sid Catlett, we have dropped in an excerpt from Thomas's clinic that he did here for our Drums and Stuff Hang in partnership with Hawthorne Drum Shop and the Percussive Arts Society. He's talking about brush technique, so if you want to check that out, stay around to the end. Now let's hand it over to Thomas.
Hey folks, Thomas Wendt back with you once again for Drum Factory Direct. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is our second episode of our brand new series entitled Portraits in Jazz, where we take just a little bit of your time to help introduce you to some of the greatest drummers in jazz and Black American music. Today we're going to be checking out one of my favorite drummers of any era, the great big Sid Catlett. Sidney Catlett was born January 17th of 1910 in Evansville, Indiana, and he started playing piano as a child, and by the time he was a teenager, his family had relocated to the great jazz city of Chicago, Illinois, where Big Sid attended Tilden High School. And during this time, he also studied with a noted teacher in Chicago at that time, a drummer named Joe Russick. Now, by the time Big Sid graduated from high school, he was a full-fledged jazz drummer working around Chicago with some of the city's best bands, including that of the great early jazz clarinetist and violinist Darnell Howard. After leaving Darnell Howard's orchestra, he joined the band of Sammy Stewart. Sammy Stewart's orchestra was big around Chicago, but they also traveled. And in the spring of 1930, a 20-year-old Big Sid Catlett landed in New York City with Sammy Stewart's orchestra, and Big Sid decided to stay in New York, and shortly after settling there, he joined the big band of the great early jazz banjo player Elmer Snowden. Elmer Snowden's band at that time was the house band at Small's Paradise in Harlem. Now, after leaving Elmer Snowden's orchestra, Big Sid had a brief stint with Rex Stewart's orchestra. At this time, he also joined the big band, a very influential and innovative big band of that day, that of the great King, Benny Carter. He also recorded with English band leader Spike Hughes. From there, he joined the big band of Sam Wooding. He also worked for a time with McKinney's Cotton Pickers, among others. Now, we've got to remember that in the early mid-30s, this was the height of the Great Depression, and things were really tough. And in 1935, Big Sid went back to Chicago, where he was working pretty steadily. He even went down to St. Louis during this time to sub for the great Papa Joe Jones in the Jeter Pillars Orchestra. After returning to Chicago in early 1936, Big Sid got a great break and joined the big band of the great Fletcher Henderson. Now, by 1936, the swing era was well underway, and big band jazz was the order of the day. And when he joined Fletcher Henderson in 1936, Big Sid was one of the great young masters of big band drumming. But there was a lot more to him than just being a great big band drummer. Big Sid was one of the most versatile drummers, really one of the most versatile musicians on any instrument during this period. Now, to give you a little bit better idea of just how great and versatile Big Sid Catlett was, here's the great Kenny Washington.
Big Sid in that period, he was a very adaptable drummer. He could play any style. Whatever you needed him to do, he could do it. Whether it be, he's like let's just say he's like the 30s and 40s O.C. Johnson or Grady Tate. He's to the 30s and 40s what O.C. Johnson and later on Grady Tate were to the 50s and 60s. He could play any style. whether it be New Orleans, Dixieland, or what have you, or swing, playing a big band, playing a small band, play behind a singer, whatever you needed him to do, he could do. And he was a virtuoso on the drums. When it comes to playing drum solos, uh, and his chops and his imagination, the things that he would come up with were just unbelievable. See, so he had it all. He had it all together.
Now, in addition to mastering all of these different jazz styles to a pretty world-class level, by the mid-1930s, Big Sid was starting to think about the drums in a slightly deeper and more musical way than most folks, especially as it pertains to improvising. We've got to remember that in the mid-1930s, the idea of an extended drum solo was something that was pretty much unheard of. But Big Sid Catlett could hear that the drums could participate as an improviser like all of the other instruments in the band. For more on this, here's Kenny again.
Big Sid plays a solo on there. He's so musical. That's another one of my favorites. Like I said, it's called Mop De Mop Mop. And he's also one of the first drummers, or one of the early drummers, that was aware of form. Like if the tune is 32 bars, he's going to play a solo that's 32 bars. If you ask him to play 2 choruses, he's going to play 2 choruses to the downbeat. So he's another one of these guys. He's one of the early guys that was aware of melody and harmony. And this is where Max Roach gets it from. It just wasn't 4 guys and a drummer. He made everybody realize that a drummer is just as much a musician as anybody else on the bandstand.
So after leaving Fletcher Henderson's orchestra, Big Sid Catlett would spend the rest of the 1930s into the 1940s working with some of the best big bands around. He had brief stints with both Don Redman and Roy Eldridge's orchestras before joining the big band of the one and only Louis Armstrong in 1938. He would work with this band into early 1942. During this time, he made a bunch of really great records with Louis Armstrong's big band on the Decca label that are definitely worth checking out. In 1941, however, he took a leave from Pops's big band to play with none other than the great Benny Goodman's orchestra. Now, there are a few studio records that Big Sid made with Benny Goodman's band, including the great Clarinet a la King. But if you really want to hear what Big Sid Catlett could do with Benny Goodman's orchestra, I would recommend checking out this double LP, Benny and Sid Roll 'Em, on the Honeysuckle Rose label. It's a double LP. There are some really amazing live performances on this double LP. It's really something to hear Big Sid play live with this big band. Now, in 1942, Big Sid decided to move back to New York City. At that time, he was working with the great pianist Teddy Wilson. And after relocating back to New York in 1942, he found himself on 52nd Street. 52nd Street was really the new hub of jazz music for the 1940s in New York City. There was all kinds of music happening on 52nd Street, including some really innovative music. And even though Big Sid was a child of both early jazz and the swing era, he was on the forefront of some of the most important new developments happening in the music during the 1940s. Here's Kenny again to talk about that.
He had it all together. I tell you what everybody should check out. Well, there are many records that are interesting. He could, and of course, Max Roach is very much influenced by him. Max is one for Big Sid, but the thing that's interesting is, like, he adapted very well to the new styles of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. He was able to play that style. Now, Kenny Clark told me that he was playing one night, and there's all of a sudden here's Big Sid, man, comes sat by the drums, and when the set was over, Big Sid was asking, Kenny Clark all these questions about hey man, how did you play that? Or what's happening with your bass drum? Or when you playing on the ride cymbal, what he was asking all these questions. So Kenny Clark told me, he said, man, he couldn't believe it, man. That, because at this time Kenny Clark was just getting started. He was just getting out there, man. And he said he couldn't believe it. He says, here's the great big Sid asking me, a little bum out here, about the things I was doing on the drums. But Big Sid, man, adapted to bebop very well. I mean, when Max Roach didn't make those dates in 1945, Sure Enough and Salt Peanuts, you know, Big Sid filled in very well. Dizzy told me that with Salt Peanuts, he said that Sid asked him what did he want him to do, and he just, Dizzy called out, he just sang that rhythm, he said that Big Sid played it right back to him, man, on the drums. He said, okay, let's go and record this.
Now, a little while back, you heard me mention some of the recordings that Big Sid made with the great Louis Armstrong's orchestra from the late 1930s. And we also talked about the great recordings he made with Benny Goodman's big band from 1941. In addition to those, I would recommend you check out some of the recordings that he made in 1932 and 1933 with the English band leader Spike Hughes. There's a CD called High Yellow that you can probably find online if you look, and there's some really wonderful music on that recording. In addition to that, I would also recommend you might try to find this CD on the Classics label under Big Sid Catlett's name, Sid Catlett 1944 through 1946. This brings together some of his most important record dates as a leader from the mid-1940s. Now, with some more great Big Sid recordings, here's Kenny with a couple of his favorites.
He could play any style. He was great with the big band. So he fit in. He fit in very well. Another record that I would recommend, Sid Flips His Lid, which is Jazz at the Philharmonic concert, and it's the trumpet virtuoso Charlie Shavers. It's basically a duet performance, even though Curly Russell is the bassist and Hank Jones is on piano. But it's like basically, as I said, a duet between Big Sid and Charlie Shavers. And the things that they do back and forth, you can hear that they have the audience in the palm of their hands. The audience is well entertained, and it's so musical, and they're having a ball. They're having a great time playing off of each other. And the things that Big Sid Catlett plays, man, are amazing. The sound is good enough that you can hear, man, this cat had some chops, man. I mean, he was not fooling. And Philly Joe Jones gets a lot from Big Sid Catlett. Another record is a date that Big Sid did under his own name. Sometimes, if you look on the internet, you might find it under Coleman Hawkins' name, but there's a tune called Mop De Mop Mop, which has Coleman Hawkins, and there's a number of other guys. I think Dick Vance is the trumpet player. Billy Taylor, a young Dr. Billy Taylor is on the record. That's another one of my favorites. Like I said, it's called Mop De Mop Mop.
Well, fortunately for us, we've got all of these great records of Big Sid Catlett to listen to and learn from, but unfortunately for him, Big Sid only lived to be 41 years old. He died of a heart attack on March 25th, 1951, while backstage at an Easter Sunday concert in Chicago. With a few final thoughts on the great Big Sid Catlett, here's Kenny again.
He's one of the early guys that was aware of melody and harmony, and this is where Max Roach gets it from. It just wasn't four guys and a drummer. he made everybody realize that a drummer is just as much a musician as anybody else on the bandstand. So yeah, he was fantastic. Luckily he made a lot of great records and was a master of brushes. Could play 17 different. Philly Joe said he had 17 different positions or ways of playing brushes, and he had a very good sound. The only problem is he just didn't live long enough. He didn't quite live into the
The 50s.
hi-fi era. Yeah, he made it into he didn't quite make it into the 50s or the hi-fi era. When you could hear the drums much better.
Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. I hope you've enjoyed this short introduction to Master Big Sid Catlett, and I hope you take some time to check out some of this music. It's really wonderful. There's going to be some links below to some of the music on our listening list, and let us know what you think about Big Sid Catlett in the comments. Let us know what some of your favorite recordings are. I look forward to seeing you next time, and until then, as always, stay safe and stay close to the music. When I first heard a drummer play brushes, it was on an album by the great Pittsburgh pianist Ahmad Jamal called Portfolio of Ahmad Jamal on the Argo label. And that featured his classic trio from the 50s, the great bassist Israel Crosby, and a wonderful drummer who was originally from New Orleans, but he's most usually associated with Chicago because that's where his career began. A drummer named Vernel Fournier, who was a true master, not just of the brushes, but of playing the drum set in a jazz setting. And I remember hearing that and being totally knocked out by the sound, and I had no idea what it was he was using to play. I knew they weren't sticks, but I had never seen a picture of any brushes or anything like that. So for a month or so, I kind of was just enjoying the music and trying to figure out, what the heck is this? And right after that, I was looking in a Modern Drummer magazine, and there was a little profile of a drummer who's largely been unfortunately forgotten to history, a wonderful drummer named Alvin Stoller, who was a West Coast drummer. He's played on a lot of records, and it was a little profile of him, and there was a black and white picture where he was playing wire brushes, and I remember looking at that picture and thinking, I bet that's what I'm hearing on those records. So I saved up my money, and my dad drove me to Mars Drum Shop in Ambridge. Anybody remember Mars Drum Shop? And oh, all right, yeah. And I bought a pair of brushes, and I took them home, and in the first 5 minutes, I realized, wow, this is really hard. And I have no idea how these drummers are doing all this. And so I kind of figured out pretty quickly that one hand was playing what was sort of sounded like the jazz syncopation or cymbal beat, and the other hand was making this swishing sound. And it wasn't long after that I saw a clip of the great Ed Thigpen's video, The Sound of Brushes. Ed Thigpen, if you're not aware of who he is, was a really wonderful drummer. His dad was a great drummer too. He played a lot with the great Oscar Peterson's trio, and he was a true master of brush playing. And it was the first time that I ever saw a video of a drummer playing brushes. And when I first started, I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, but I was sweeping clockwise with my left hand like this, which is a perfectly fine way to do it. But Ed Thigpen would sweep counterclockwise. And I remember looking at this video thinking man, that looks really slick. What is he doing? So I sat down and I kind of tried it, and it was a little hard, but I realized that it actually worked a lot better for me for the most part than sweeping clockwise. And the reason for that is I realized that by turning my hand over, I was able to control how much of the body of the brush is on the drum head by just moving my top fingers just a little bit like that. So like so. So I started playing a lot like that. I still play sweeping clockwise, but as you might have noticed already, I sweep counterclockwise quite a bit. So that's kind of how I came to the brushes, and they've been kicking my behind for 30 years. So if you're new to brushes, The brushes kind of go all the way back to the beginning of this music. This instrument that we all play was really created to play jazz music. Before jazz music, the drum set didn't exist. There was a bass drummer, a snare drummer, player of the cymbals and whatnot. So this instrument was sort of created to play this music. And in the 19-teens, drummers were trying to figure out how to play a little more quiet because there was really no kind of amplification back then yet. And since bass drums and snare drums, which really sort of constituted the earliest drum sets, were pretty much the same as what we play today, you could get almost as much sound out of a snare drum and a bass drum back then as you can today. So it was very much, drummers had to learn how to play quiet, and so brushes sort of developed out of that. And it wasn't really until the swing era in the mid to late 1930s that sort of the way that we all play brushes today sort of coalesced. And the two drummers, there were a lot of drummers that contributed to this. All of the early drummers in the 20s, like Warren Baby Dodds, Zooty Singleton, Cuba Austin, Kaiser Marshall, Walter Johnson, all of these men created sort of this language. But there's two drummers that really sort of brought in all the early innovations into what we do today, and that would be the great Big Sid Catlett and the great Papa Joe Jones. They sort of took all of the early innovations and came up with this idea of the left hand, or your non-dominant hand. If you're a lefty, you would most likely sweep with your right hand, although I've seen drummers do some pretty interesting things with brushes that work. But the conventional way is sort of having your non-dominant hand sweeping and your dominant hand playing the syncopation. And Sid Catlett and Joe Jones really sort of solidified that, and I kind of come out of their sort of tradition of doing it. And the way that I sort of approach it from them is when I play the time stroke with my right hand, I'm using, for the most part, just the tip of the brush. Sometimes when I see drummers play, especially if they're new to playing brushes, they'll try to play the time stroke using like the full body of the brush. Now, there's nothing really wrong with that. That can sound fine if that's the effect that you're looking for. But the reason that I play with the tip of the brush is because it's a higher pitched sound, and that can be heard a little bit easier throughout a band than if I'm playing like this. It's a lower sound, and you don't get quite the clarity that you do. So that's kind of why I do that, and I found that it works pretty well in most situations. Now, the way I do it is one way. I should make that disclaimer. There are a lot of great ways to play brushes. There are a lot of really cool innovators in the drumming world that have done some really, really interesting things with brushes. But again, this is just my way of doing it. So if we take it hand by hand, just playing a basic time stroke, one of the first things that can be problematic if you're new to playing brushes is getting a consistent sweeping sound with your left hand, if you're a righty, of course. And one of the things that you can do to work on that's pretty simple is you can use a metronome, or I would probably recommend using a good recording, just something nice and sort of down the middle tempo-wise. It's not too fast or too slow. And just play quarter notes with your right hand and work on. And then if you really want to hear what you're doing, just move the quarter note over to your leg, and you can really hear if your left hand is doing anything inconsistent. Now, sometimes you want to manipulate that sound, and that's fine. But at first, you want to just be able to get a good, consistent sweeping sound. And then when you bring the right hand over, the way I play is like that. Excuse me. But you can also play. It doesn't matter either way, is fine. But I do it like this. That's just kind of how I started and how I've not changed in all these years. So that's sort of how I approach a basic time stroke. Just playing a medium tempo. Now, when you get into various tempos, things change a little bit. So, as the tempo increases, you got to work with physics a little bit, because if you're playing like this in a sort of conventional way, as the tempo gets faster, you're going to find that you can't get around the whole drum in time, and also if the tempo really gets up there, you're not going to be able to have time to cross over. So as the tempo gets faster, your sweeping circle should get smaller, and then eventually, if it gets fast enough, you can just leave your right hand over on the right side of the drum, or vice versa if you're a lefty. So starting slow. Something like that. So you see, as the tempo goes up, everything just becomes smaller because there's just literally not enough time, right? That's one of the major rules that I follow for playing different tempos. Now, on the ballad end, or the slower side, this is when it gets actually, in my opinion, a little bit more difficult. I've always thought that playing slower is a lot harder than playing faster because there's a lot more space and a lot more time for stuff to go wrong. So playing ballads with brushes, there's several different ways that you can sort of do it in a traditional sense. Probably the easiest is, as the left hand doesn't really change, you're going to be sweeping just slower. The right hand, instead of playing the cymbal beat, when it's a real ballad, your right hand begins to sweep as well. And sort of the easiest way to approach it at first, if you're new to it, is to just sweep in a quarter note sort of pulse. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. That works very well. There are a lot of different brush strokes that you can use for slower tempos. I don't have a whole lot of fancy brush strokes that I use. I have several that I sort of utilize in slightly different ways. But also, when you're playing a ballad, you can sweep in different pulses as well. You can sweep in an 8-note pulse. Sorry. You can do that. A lot of times also, I'll use, if I'm sweeping in a quarter note pulse, sometimes, when you're playing this music, as we are, we're not reading any arrangements, we haven't rehearsed anything. Sometimes, when you play a ballad, the tempo can feel like it's moving forward or even dragging. And sometimes you can use those simple different pulsing strokes to sort of nudge the tempo in a little bit more comfortably. So if I'm playing in a quarter note pulse, I can also play and that little shade can help sort of nudge the tempo forward or back, however you need it, because you never want to strong arm the time, right? You never want to try to do that. You always want to be musical and subtle. So playing ballads can be a real challenge because of the slow tempo. And the other thing to work on as well, in addition to being able to play the time where you can definitely hear the pulse, you might also want to work on playing in ballad time when you really can't hear a pulse, because sometimes artistically that's what you want. A great example of that would be the famous album Kinda Blue. The great Jimmy Cobb is on that record. If you listen to, there's a beautiful ballad on there called Flamenco Sketches, and it's a beautiful tune, and it's a very sort of sparse mood, very kind of a somber mood. And Jimmy Cobb does this beautiful thing where he's basically playing like this. Now you can hear the brushes moving, but you can't really hear a dictated pulse, right? Now, on that record, if he had just swept in quarter notes, that would have been fine. Probably nobody ever would have questioned anything. But it was a very beautiful artistic choice that he made to play more like this, because it fit the mood of the tune and the moment perfectly. One of the things with brushes is, as you can probably tell if you already did know, it's all about subtlety and nuance, right? Because these are much softer than sticks. So sometimes a very subtle change in your playing can have a very big effect
on the music. So don't ever think that, to sort of get the music to a new place, that you have to do something really crazy. A lot of times you don't. Sometimes the most subtle change can give the music just what it needs. So in addition to sort of these conventional brush strokes, there's a few other sort of different time strokes that I use once in a while. And I'll try to come up with some recorded examples. So one other way to play time is where you're basically doing a conventional time stroke, but instead of the cymbal beat, you're just going to sweep with your right hand. If you listen to, there's a great record on Blue Note, the Magnificent Thad Jones Volume 1, the great Max Roach is on that record with Barry Harris and Percy Heath, and they play April in Paris on there, and they play it kind of at a tempo like right here, and it's sort of, Percy Heath is playing this sort of pedal on the bass, and Max is playing brushes, and again, he could have played just a conventional brush stroke and it would have sounded fine, but he's doing this, and it adds so much character and flavor to the music when he does that. That's a great example of that. A faster version of that stroke, if you listen to Miles Davis's Milestones on Columbia, the great Philly Joe Jones, there's a classic piano trio track on there called Billy Boy, which features Red Garland and Paul Chambers. And if you listen, Philly Joe starts out on brushes, and the tempo is kind of about here, roughly, and on the A sections, he's just playing regular time stroke, but on the bridge, he goes to... Sorry. And it just changes the flavor just enough that it gives the music like this cool little lift, right? Another great example of a similar sort of variant of the time stroke is another great Miles Davis album, Walkin' on Prestige, which features Horace Silver, Percy Heath, and the great Pittsburgh drummer Kenny Clark. They do Miles's tune Solar on there, and Kenny Clark starts out just playing a standard sort of time stroke, but then during Miles's solo, he starts playing this sweeping stroke that's almost like a straight eighth feel, and it gives it this whole, like, it's like the lens changes on it. So he goes from like this to... And I remember the first time I heard that record, I was like, what is he doing? Like, man, that's cool, but man, what the heck? But it gives Miles's solo this totally unique flavor, and then when the alto solo comes back in, he goes back to the traditional pattern. So a subtle change like that can give the music this like new angle. Great examples of that. And then finally, I think I actually did it when we played Afternoon in Paris. Vernel Fournier, who I mentioned earlier with the great Ahmad Jamal, this stroke works great if you're playing in a slow to medium tempo and the bass player is playing in 2, right? And it's a simple sweeping stroke, but it really sort of emphasizes the 2 feeling. Could you play like rhythm changes just in 2? 1, 2, 3, 4. It's kind of a cool little stroke that's quite different than the conventional time pattern, right? So those are some examples of, and Vernel did that quite a bit with Ahmad's trio as well. That was a very common sort of alternate time stroke that he used. So that's just some very basic sort of ways that I approach brushes, and there's so many different sounds that you can get out of these, and as difficult as they are to play, there's many ways that you can sort of decorate the music a little bit more than with sticks even, I think. Maybe you could argue differently, but I think for those of you that are new to it, one of the hardest things is learning how to sort of phrase and play rhythms using sweeping strokes instead of regular, strokes like you would with a stick. But I highly recommend practice with recordings. so that you can get an idea of what it feels like to play time and just play in general with a bass player. The other thing about brushes too, especially if you're new to it, for years I would play brushes on gigs where not Paul, but other bass players would have their amp up a little too loud, or the guitarist would have their amp up a little too loud, or there's a keyboard. There's a certain threshold where it's very difficult to play these. They're very acoustic-oriented tools. If you're playing brushes with an acoustic pianist and an acoustic bass player that knows how to use an amp, it's wonderful. But other times, it can be really challenging. So don't get down on yourself if you're on a gig and you're like, man, I can't hear this, it feels terrible. It might not be you. I'll just say that.